My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask you for pardon of my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. In today's Gospel we see the story of the two disciples who are on their way to Emmaus on Easter Sunday morning, fleeing from Jerusalem, really, when they are met by Jesus and they don't recognize him. And the story begins like this. Two of the disciples of Jesus were on their way to a village called Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking together about all that had happened. Now, as they talked this over, Jesus himself came up and walked by their side, but something prevented them from recognizing him. That's always perplexed me, because we see that in other scenes in the Gospel also, how people, for example, the holy women at the tomb, especially Mary Magdalene, don't recognize Jesus to begin with. If you remember, Mary Magdalene thinks that Jesus is the gardener before she finally recognizes him. So something a bit strange. Another translation of that last line that we saw is, their eyes were held fast. So there's something in them or outside them which is preventing them from recognizing Jesus. What is it? Why don't they recognize Jesus immediately? Why doesn't Mary Magdalene recognize him? Are the other apostles also at times when Jesus is risen and appears to them, like in Galilee, they don't recognize him very quickly? Why is this? Well, Pope Benedict gave an interesting description or explanation why this was so. And he said that recognizing Jesus isn't just a question of the external vision. It is related to something in the person themselves. So we see something in the resurrection which is very relevant to us and to our relationship with you, Lord. Clearly, you don't want to force people to recognize you, because then, well, they kind of have to follow you, even if they didn't want to. You want people to recognize you almost more with their heart than with their external eyes, to recognize you moved by love in some way. And we would think, well, maybe, Lord, I would recognize you better in the circumstances, in people I meet, in the Eucharist, in the sacraments, if I had more love. Remember Mary Magdalene. So she, initially, as we saw, she thinks he is the gardener. But then when Jesus uses her name and he says Mary, now anybody could have known her name, so there's nothing very miraculous about that. But there's something about the way that Jesus says her name that immediately makes her realize this is Jesus, that he has risen from the dead, that the resurrection has taken place. And that is more love than anything else. Especially, it's very personal, isn't it? The way somebody might say your name, the way your mother might say your name, or a best friend, or anyway, something special about the way they say their name. And for Mary Magdalene, there's something obviously very special when she hears Mary spoken by Jesus with your Galilean accent, Lord. Immediately, her heart takes over what her eyes don't manage to do. Her heart sees that this is Jesus. Now, with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, Jesus asked them, well, what have they been talking about on the way? And we're told they stopped short, their faces downcast. They're looking very, very gloomy. And we could say that Jesus now has to do an eye-opening operation. They've no faith. They're not even looking up at the world, actually. They're just looking down at their feet. And for the next little while, Jesus has to do an eye-opening operation on the two disciples. And what does he do? Well, the Gospel tells us today, then starting with Moses and going through all the prophets, he explained to them the passages throughout the scriptures that were about himself. And we can imagine there was a wonderful class, maybe an hour, 2 hours. And Jesus says, remember what Moses said. Remember what Isaiah says. And remember Psalm 22. And remember this other psalm. And remember the book of Daniel. And our Lord is going through all these writings from the Old Testament that these two men knew inside out. They'd studied this since they were young children. He gives them this wonderful class in Scripture. So much, so wonderful that later on, after they recognized Jesus and the breaking of bread in Emmaus, in the inn there, they comment to each other. They say, did not our hearts burn within us, as he talked to us on the road and explained the Scriptures to us? So in that kind of class that Jesus gives them, they realize that all that time, their hearts were getting warmer and warmer and warmer, and were kind of burning by the end of the conversation. Isn't that nice? And this is very interesting, I think, these days, and it's something that we can imagine you want, Jesus, that perhaps we would discover. And that is that most people don't have access to Mass and even to the Eucharist these days. However, we do have access to sacred Scripture. This is the whole first part of this miracle, or this interaction of Jesus appearing to the two disciples. And it is like a Mass. Many people have pointed that out. It's like a Mass in that it begins with the explanation of Scripture, and that's like the liturgy of the Word. And then the second half, when Jesus goes into the inn with the two disciples and sits down and breaks bread with them, it's the Eucharist. And they recognize him in the breaking of bread. And of course, these days, okay, most people don't have access to you, Lord, through the breaking of bread. But we do have access to you through the whole first part of this scene, sacred Scripture. And when I say sacred Scripture, I'm thinking especially about the Gospel, because we always have that, don't we? In Mass, we always have reading. Well, it doesn't always have to be the Old Testament. Well, we always have the Psalm, and we have a first reading, Psalm, maybe a second reading on Sundays and so on. But you always have the Gospel reading, and that's the culmination of the sacred Scripture readings. Now, when we pick up the Gospel to read it, or the whole sacred Scripture, but especially the Gospel, we shouldn't pick it up like just any old book. It is something very special. Here's a little point that St. Josemaria makes. When you open the Holy Gospel, think that what is written there, the words and deeds of Christ, is something that you should not only know, but live. Everything, every point that is told there has been gathered detail by detail for you to make it come alive in the individual circumstances of your life. So in other words, it's a bit like, this is not just the story of Jesus' life. The Gospel, when you pick it up, is the story of your life. And my life too. So those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, you're not just reading about something that happened to two men that you don't really know 2,000 years ago. You're looking at your life. You are one of those two disciples, Cleophas and his unnamed companion. Well, that's you. You're Cleophas. You haven't recognized Jesus, but he's talking to you. And maybe through this little 10 minutes of conversation with Jesus, and we are unpacking Scripture here, we're unpacking the Gospel, as Jesus unpacked sacred Scripture for the two disciples. So we see the Gospel comes to life again in each one of us. And that can have a huge impact if we approach the Gospel in that way, not kind of detached, but really thinking, this is my life. And there'll be many saints. St. Anthony is very famous because he heard a gospel, the story of the rich young man, and when he heard that, he was very rich himself. He sold all his goods, and he went off and became a very famous hermit, one of the first hermits in the history of the Church. So it's very important for us. A few years ago, Pope Francis actually advised us to keep a copy of the Bible on us. Now we could have it on our phone also, but to keep a copy of the Bible there and to look at it again and again throughout the day. And he said something very interesting. He said, what would happen if we turned back when we forgot it? If we opened it more times a day? If we read the message of God contained in the Bible the way we read messages on our cell phones? It's true, isn't it? We're all anxious to see who sent me a WhatsApp, who sent me a text. But our Lord is sending us all these texts, these sacred texts, and they're there for us all the time to unpack our own life. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections, and inspirations you have communicated to me in this meditation. I ask you for help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede.